of Rural Development Initiatives. We are a rural hub organization here in the Pacific Northwest, and we had the honor and privilege to lead an initiative called Rural Lead, which focused on understanding the field of rural leadership development and strengthening that field over a year-long process.
Rural Lead is a national initiative that has been working to better understand the ways that rural leaders are cultivated and supported to advance stronger and more thriving communities. And we have emphasized equity as an important part of that work.
I would say anyone who is doing rural development in any way, shape, or form is doing rural leadership development. They have to.
There's a lot of leaders in rural communities that don't realize they're leaders. Even during our Southern Learning journey, I was making calls to people who were identified as leaders by community members multiple times. And they'd be like, oh, I don't think of myself as a leader. Well, of course you don't, because you're just getting up to do the work that you do every day, just trying to make your community better. But the fact is, you're the person that people come to. They see that you're trying to make change. They see your commitment, and that makes you a leader.
One of the most important aspects of rural leadership is this idea of mentorship and invitation. I got involved as a leader because I wanted to improve the quality of life in my community, and I was also focused on economy building. I think there needs to be a realization that nobody's going to ride in on a white horse and save you.
In order to help folks get the additional training, the additional support, the additional networks that they may need to do even better work, we have to think hard about ways of recruiting them and identifying them to help them feel a part of strong rural leadership development work. We need to pay a lot of attention to is the people who are less visible by the dominant populations. Native communities are often unseen by their neighbors.
As First Nations Development Institute stated in a report they published, rural Native America is twice invisible. This is due to lots of different factors, data collection parameters, and outdated census definitions, and then just poor data quality, which unfortunately has led to a true misunderstanding about the real nature of Native communities and Indian country in rural space.
Rural Lead changed the way that I approach my work by helping me to create a new awareness, a new consciousness about the value of the work that I do along with others in rural communities.
The biggest misconceptions about rural in rural America is that it is white and conservative. So my people are from the rural South, not white. We're not conservative. We're pretty progressive. So I think that's one of the challenges or misconceptions that people have the narrative wrong. Rural is diverse, and it's becoming more diverse.
Rural is not one thing. It is lots of individual experiences that are unique to a certain place and culture. And saying that rural is only this does it a disservice.
We often associate rural America with like old traditional ways of working, lacking innovation. But if you think about where alternative energy is happening and those jobs associated with alternative energy, a lot of that is happening in rural America. Rural America is teaching the rest of America how to embrace innovation.
The narrative about rural communities has to be updated and improved. There is a very familiar, comfortable narrative about rural being land with no people and rolling hills and being completely isolated. And there are elements of that are true. But there are other things. There are people there. The people don't all wear plaid. The people aren't always all on farms. There are people of color, and rural is not this one thing. It covers a wide variety. I think a lot of times policy is based on that narrative, and we need ways to make sure that we're addressing the true narrative, the strengths of the community, how rural communities know collaboration better than any other because they've had to. There are simply less people, and as a result of that, the people who are there have to work together. And it's about how they work together.
Integrating equity into all rural leadership development is an intentional act, and it must be intentional. It has to be something that you focus on with purpose. 100% of the people who we worked with the field builders, with our partners, leave that initiative with the intentionality of integrating rural equity into their work. And that is a broad group of people.
One of the ways rural communities can be more equitable is to shift power dynamics. Leadership in rural communities sometimes depends on a family name or income, but we really want to develop those leaders that are trusted within community. And what that looks like is giving them the social capital they need and the power they need to be able to be at the table and make decisions that's most important for their community.
It is on us as a country, on policymakers, on funders, to understand just how much we have left rural places behind.
Rural places are small and memories are long. People who have traditionally been making decisions have often owned the land or owned the factory or owned the mine. They've had a lot of power and control over other people's lives in the communities. And to bring people who have traditionally been left out and been marginalized in rural communities, we need to think hard and take real care at finding thoughtful ways of bringing them in and engaging them in rural leadership development work.
I envision rural communities becoming more equitable by having intentional conversations, rural leaders and urban leaders being brought to the same table.
One of the biggest needs is peer support and networking. Sometimes being in a rural community can be isolating, but definitely being a leader who is taking on a lot of issues and probably a lot of people's trauma can be isolating. And so making sure that they're connected to other leaders in other communities to talk about those issues, and making sure that as somebody that often works in rural communities, that I can be a lending ear.
One of the things that Rural Lead did really well is bring together all kinds of rural leadership development practitioners, people who run traditional training programs, people who do work through community organizing, people who are advocates in local organizations connected to statewide advocacy organizations, people who do collaborative, team-based community problem solving in rural communities. And there are not enough connections across those kinds of folks who approach leadership development work with different theories of change, if you will. And we could do a lot more in the field to think about how to build networks.
Seeing the difference between the work that I've done in urban areas versus what I see in rural areas where folks are more isolated, they have less resources, they're working with less, but they are committed to their community. And this love of community, that's what keeps me part of the work. And to have just a small window of opportunity to help a rural leader to achieve what they want to achieve, to have their vision come to life, that's what's exciting to me.
The needs of rural leadership development practitioners include connection to one another. I think it includes support from people who do similar work, but also the freedom to understand what that means to adapt our work to the rural places that we serve.
There's smaller populations in rural places, of course, and so those outcomes are going to look a lot different. And you have to think about those small wins. We're not going to change 300 people at once. It could take 10 years to see your investments in a leader and in leadership development really pay off. But you can say, like, do people feel like their voice is being heard in a community? Do people feel like change is happening in community? That is something that I learned from Rural Lead, is thinking differently about how you measure those outcomes and change that happens.
There's an education that has to happen also with urban neighbors, urban leaders, to understand the true value of rural. And I think that also means that rural leaders need the tools to better tell their own stories, to better tell their narrative to those urban leaders, and build some true coalitions that work for both parties.
There are not many national initiatives that are so intentional about bringing regional players together. We had a real cross-cultural team that sometimes made it hard, but it made the work deeper and more effective. And I think a really good blueprint for how to think about the right kind of people who should be around the table thinking about the field of rural leadership development.
Rural Lead changed the way I approach my work in so many ways. How do we integrate the differences within our community and assure that all the outcomes in the work are benefiting all people, all of our neighbors in our rural communities?
Equity is particularly important when we think about the concept of interdependence in a community. And this often means things like understanding how historic events have impacted current social structures or the social fabric of the community, even in modern times. And so we have decided we are going to include pieces of that in a new leadership development program that we're creating.
I learned so much just through that connection, through that ability to engage, whether it was one-on-one or in a group setting. And through that engagement, I just walked away extremely inspired, hopeful about what the future has in store for rural America. And I also walked away with a really extensive network of movers and shakers, our rural practitioners.
This is really a field, and I don't think that we have traditionally done enough to recognize the field of rural leadership development and rural capacity building, and to think about how to build the requisite research, networks, peer learning opportunities, listservs, the connective tissue that builds a field. And I'm hoping this is the beginning of the conversation to think about how to do that.
Leaders need flexible funds to just be great, right? They know what they need to do in community, and they need the funds to be able to do that. In terms of thinking about leadership development practitioners, I think that they also need some more flexible funding so they can be more creative in the programs that they develop.
The funding going into rural places is this, we tend to think in big dollars. We tend to think in large amounts of investment, and figuring out how to get large investments and big money into small places is a problem that needs to be addressed, that we need to figure out how to do better. I don't know if it is as much about what questions are left to ask with Rural Lead and that initiative. I think it is what is the work that should come from this point. And the network of rural leadership development practitioners that Rural Lead formed is invaluable. It's invaluable not only to us, those of us who do rural leadership development, but to the communities we serve. And it is absolutely invaluable to funders, to policymakers, to others who are looking to bring in rural voice, who are looking to elevate in rural interests to policy and practices and funding. I believe that rural leaders are the answer to us reaching equity for rural communities. I envision rural communities becoming equitable through 1,000 points of light.